Like we'll have two new Hall of Famers in Cooperstown and baseball's Hall of Fame. By the way, Cooperstown, if you haven't been there, what a great place. If you have been there, it's worth a return visit. I've been there once about 10 summers ago. I look forward to going back sooner than later, I hope. And when I go back, there's no doubt about it that Lee Smith and Harold Baines will be in Cooperstown. They'll have their place. They'll be enshrined this coming summer in 2019 as Hall of Famers. Interestingly enough, both respective players came up in Chicago in 1980. Baines with the White Sox, Lee Smith with the Chicago Cubs. Now, how'd they get into the Hall of Fame? Interestingly enough, they had their chance with the baseball writers. Both of them failed to get in that way, as Smith garnered around 50% of the vote in his term with the baseball writers. I think like 15 seasons. Baines, he had been around getting his share of the votes. Not enough, though, with the baseball writers since 2007, like 5-6% of the votes. They get in this time around by something called, let me give it to you directly, a 16-member called Today's Game Error Commission with a review of 10 named ballots comprised of Hall of Fame members. Guys from different eras: Roberto Alomar, Burt Blyleven, Pat Gillick. You got guys who were in ownership or executive roles like Jerry Reinsdorf. A couple of media members like Tim Kirkjohn of ESPN. So an interesting committee there. Did they get it right? I don't know. I don't think so. Not at least when it comes to Baines, okay? I think Lee Smith, no doubt about it, a dominant figure as a closer during his time. An outstanding pitcher, 18 seasons, 7-time All-Star, a runner-up in a Cy Young, pitched for many different teams, 8 different teams. He was a leader in both leagues, twice in the National League in his respective category as a closer, saves once in the American League. Dominant closer. When he retired, he was the all-time saves leader with 478. That's third best now, behind Mariano Rivera and Trevor Hoffman, who have both surpassed Lee Smith. So I have no problems with Smith, who had one of the nastiest fastballs going at the time, getting into the Hall of Fame. Now, interestingly enough, Smith, like Baines, never a world champion. Never really had their shining moment, like they say March Madness, right? One shining moment. Never really had that. Not distinctive in the postseason. Baines, really just not a distinctive major leaguer as an all-time great. Let's take a look at some of his numbers. Okay, all-time. As far as he goes, he was a DH about 60% of the time in his career. When he wasn't a DH, he was a so-so right fielder. Beloved in Chicago's South Side. You got to respect that. The fans loved him. And those Chicago White Sox fans would know better, a lot better than me, of just how good he was day in and day out. However, I'm old enough, I don't want to date myself too much, to remember Harold Baines clearly as a player. I just never remember him as a guy who jumped off the page as an all-time great, therefore a Hall of Famer. 22 seasons, compiler, can make that argument. 2,866 hits, a 289 lifetime hitter, 384 home runs, 6-time All-Star. Only 4 times was he in MVP voting in the top 10. Interestingly, the first round overall pick in 1977's draft goes to show you they knew what they were doing, the White Sox scouts. Like it or not, the guy wound up being a Hall of Famer, right? The third player, this is a longevity stat. I'm sorry, he's the 38th player, okay? With at least 11,000 at-bats. So that's pretty amazing. 38 players. He's one of them that have done that with all the thousands in the century plus of big league baseball. And 34th all-time in RBI, so that's impressive. Just never had that one shining moment to me. Not a World Series champion. A 300-plus hitter. I think it's 324. His biggest moment came playing for the 1990 A's. right? The back end of that Bash Brothers team with Tony La Russa guiding them as La Russa, a former manager there with Baines in Chicago. So they got him on board on that Oakland A's team. By the way, Baines played 14 seasons with the White Sox. The rest of them spent mainly with the Orioles, another 7. And as I mentioned, also played with the Oakland A's in that 90 World Series. They were upset by Eric Davis. How about Eric Davis? And the Cincinnati Reds. I'll never forget that World Series. What a big underdog since he was. They took out Baines. So Baines had his one chance at glory. Some of the names that do not get in, okay? Let's start with some of the players first. You talk about Baines. Never really distinguishing himself. Well, how about Joe Carter? How can Joe Carter not be in the Hall of Fame? Fall of 1992, true story. Tempe, Arizona. Late October, pouring rain, cold, bitter night for Arizona. I was at Sun Devil Stadium watching U2. I think it was the Zooropa tour. Remember that? And Bono, who didn't know anything about baseball, announced in his Irish accent something to the effect of, "I don't know much about baseball." That's horrible. I'll just keep going in my voice. But Joe Carter of the Blue Jays won the World Series. And he said something like that, just kind of some random sentence out there. I remember that like yesterday. A great concert. I missed it because I was at the concert. But, of course, back then you had SportsCenter, the real SportsCenter. You see ESPN went back to SportsCenter. Conversation for another day. But Joe Clark wins a World Series off Mitch the Wild Thing Williams in 92. A walk-off game-winning home run. 8 of 9 seasons, okay? From 89 to 97, he had 100 more RBIs. Amazing. Great ball player. And he had that distinctive shining moment. Toronto All-Star with the Cleveland Indians. Talking in the Indians, talking about them. How about Albert Bell? By the way, Carter was a guy that, you liked. Had a nice charisma about him, and I believe the baseball writers liked him. Albert Bell, talking about the Indians, they didn't like him. Had his problems off the field. Issues, that's for sure. But on the field, he was dynamite. From 92 to 2000, every season, 100-plus RBIs. 152 in 98. 148 in 95. Played in some big-time series in the late 90s for the Indians against the Yankees and the ALCS in 97. Never forget that. The Marlins a few years later, in the World Series, but don't wind up coming up on the short end of the stick. Had a great career, Albert Bell. Don't call me Joey Bell. Those two guys don't get in, but Harold Baines does. Charlie Manuel, Davey Johnson, hit more than 40 home runs as a second baseman, as a player. Of course, a great manager, won the Mets' last World Championship with the 86 team, successful as a skipper of the Baltimore Orioles. He doesn't get in, as does Lou Piniella. More distinguished as a manager, talking about the 90 Reds. He was the skipper of that team. Of course, a big part of the Yankees cog in their championship teams as a player in 77, 78. Lou Piniella does not get in. And speaking of one of the all-time snubs not to get in again, how about him? Simply known as the boss, George Steinbrenner. Bought the Yankees for $10 million in 1973. Last year, Forbes valued the Yankees at $4 billion. May he rest in peace, the boss. Integral in 7 world championship teams as an owner, bringing in such free agent prizes as Reggie Jackson, Dave Winfield, Alex Rodriguez. Instrumental in getting Roger Clemens in pinstripes 2 times. He brought in the personas, brought in the personalities. I know I'm forgetting a bunch of them. How about his spats on and off with Billy Martin? What was he, 5 times the Yankees manager? They even did a great Miller Lite commercial, didn't they? Great taste, less filling. How can you forget that? George stepped up and did whatever he could take, for good, bad, or worse. I know he earned himself a suspension trying to dig dirt on Dave Winfield. So he found himself into some trouble. Way too impatient at times, firing Yogi Berra. And I believe he brought back Martin the 4th or 5th time, and that was, 85 season, I want to say? I know he pulled the trigger and did some crazy things, but overall, 7 world championships, what he was able to build the Yankees as a business and enterprise, an evil empire, as the Red Sox would call him. Look what he did with the Yes Network alone. As a businessman, a passionate owner, and a guy who delivered championships and kept the New York Yankees dynasty afloat, I think there's no way that George Steinbrenner shouldn't go into the Hall of Fame. So again, this year, Harold Baines for now and Lee Smith are the entrants into this year's Hall of Fame. Thanks again to today's Game Error Committee. Do I agree? 50-50. Lee Smith, yes. Baines, no. Baines, a very productive player for his time, a steady Eddie. Maybe, again, I don't appreciate him as much as I would if I was a Chicagoan and a White Sox fan. There's a good website, by the way. As I wrap up this piece, it is done by, it's called the ringer.com. And they had a great article about Harold Baines going in to the Hall of Fame. Within the article, they break down every single sabermetric or Moneyball or statistical analytic category from Jaws to this one, that one, and comparing his deficiencies to today's modern players, to some of the players who didn't go in. I mean, it just ranks every single historical statistical standard you want to read about. And in fact, here's what they had to say. A quick quote. I won't read you the whole thing. I'll just kind of paraphrase it. They say Baines is now the 7th least deserving Hall of Famer after fellow right fielder Tommy McCarthy, and then they list a bunch of other players from back in the day, guys I didn't grow up with necessarily know. And they mention the other players, and then they go on to say that Baines, statistically speaking, is probably the worst player to qualify for the Hall in 42 years. His election is just shocking and an error of relatively enlightened evaluation. Very interesting way to put it, and a good read, theringer.com. Check that out. But again, I'm down with Lee Smith. Baines, I don't necessarily think he's the most deserving Hall of Famer. Good guy, steady Eddie, very good baseball player, but deserving to be in Cooperstown?